Welcome to the Cask 88 Lock-In, the internet's premier show of whiskey wisdom and wit. Now, before you get too entranced by your gorgeous gadgets, your mesmerizing video displays, remember that information is not knowledge. Knowledge is not wisdom, and wisdom is not foresight. Each leads from the other, and we need them all. So, with a sharpened eye and a critical brain, enjoy the interviews that I have for you this week. On with the show. One of the troubles with whiskey being so gosh darn popular is that you can often find yourself jostled by other like-minded enthusiasts who just want the same thing you do. For a more relaxed experience of learning about or tasting whiskey, the smaller tours might be for you. My next guest organises both. Justine Hazlehurst, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Your sort of particular niche within the world of whiskey, or at least one of them, is the history of whiskey, which is something we've kind of lightly brushed on, but we haven't really focused too much on the history in these shows so far.
The first written reference to Scotch whisky, I suppose, was 1494. So Ushkabar, very strong spirit off the stills, at that time probably flavoured with herbs, botanicals, just to make it more palatable, but certainly there was no let's mature it in a cask for at least 3 years regulation, so it would have been very different. So Friar John Core was asked to make aqua vitae from malt, and that was at Lindores Abbey. How did the art of distilling arrive in Scotland? There are many theories, but I think the main one is that it came from Ireland. So one of the big things that I talk about is the invention of the patent still, the process of continuous distillation. You've got Robert Stein, I'm not sure how you would say it, 1826, I think he invented his still, but more importantly, that was improved by Aeneas Coffey, so the coffee still in 1830. The production of grain spirit, which then later on with the Spirits Act in the 1860s, that could be, you could blend this grain spirit and this all these single malts, and you could do that under bond. Huge step, because obviously blended whiskey was, I think, what made the Scotch whisky industry. Yeah. So that's what took it to Scotch whisky as a brand, I think, in its own right. And then I suppose we had troubles, lots of obstacles, lots of thorns. You've got the Patterson crash at the end of the 1800s, then you have 2 world wars, then you have prohibition in the States, and that was all of that, proved quite a turbulent period for the Scotch whisky industry. So, trying to weather that storm. And then as a result, you have smaller companies not being able to deal with all of that. The implications of those troubled times lend themselves to understanding why the Scotch whisky landscape is the way that it is now. Going up to the 1980s, up until that point, there was no real single malt market. Only a very small proportion of Scotch whisky was bottled as single malt bottlings. When things really started to change, the downturn of Scotch whisky, things like the Scotch Malt Whisky Society being set up to bottle single malt, single cask, and I think that again changed the sort of landscape.
And so from that, you've grown your tour company, Cask Whisky, with 2 Ks. A really fine tour that you do, that we at the Cask 88 office team, we went with you around Leith, and you told us you used to be a real kind of beating heart, a core of whiskey. But yeah, sort of, what was it that drew you into Leith to discover its secrets?
Where I live, when I first moved in, just opposite, there was an old sort of derelict bonded warehouse. I was really intrigued as to the history of it. So I started to try to find out, and discovered that there were about 90 to 100 bonded warehouses in Leith at one particular time, and found out so much about Leith's whiskey history. Yeah, so that's really how the Leith Whiskey Trail started.
I thoroughly recommend to anyone who visits Edinburgh and wants to find out more about whiskey, do take one of Justine's whiskey walks through Leith, because it takes you through so many fantastic areas. The architecture of Leith is kind of given a whole new definition. And then, of course, at the end of the tour, there is whiskey tasting. Actually, your tastings are old blended whiskies, kind of real classics. So how come you made that choice?
I would say virtually all of the whiskey that was bottled here in Leith was blended whiskey. And so I source these bottles and then tailor the route to the bottles that I can find. The tasting at the end is usually the bit that people are quite surprised about. So the guy who's the landlord of the pub where we have the tasting, he's been there for 27 years. He's a single malt drinker. I gave him a bottle of Hanky Bannister from the 1960s. I gave him a little sip of that. But I gave it to him blind, didn't tell him what it was. And he was absolutely certain it was a single malt. He wouldn't believe me when I told him it was a blend. So it's always amazing to see, people's reactions when they try it.
Another string to your bow is that you are an organizer of the Fife Whiskey Festival, one of the younger whiskey festivals around.
It's a cracking wee festival. It's much smaller, let's put it that way. We have a much smaller crowd, so it's quite a big venue. It's the sort of festival where you can get to the stand. You're not going to be, 3-4 deep. Exhibitors will have the opportunity to stand and chat to you at length. I think that's what makes it, that wee bit different. I would say it's a very, very relaxed festival.
I think that's the nice take-home message here. If you're ever visiting Scotland and you want to have a nice, relaxed whiskey experience, which really gives your curiosity time to find its focus, then any of the things that Justine does, either the festivals or the tours around Edinburgh or the wider area, it's something worth considering when we're allowed to move around normally again. Justine Hazlehurst, thank you so much for joining us again and being so candid.
Cheers, thanks.
Good morning, Sam. The time is 1100 hours.
Good morning, Advanced Dramming Algorithm 9000. Is everything proceeding according to schedule?
Yes, Sam. The first interview proceeded flawlessly, and I'm about to engage the musical guest.
Oh, the musical interview. Excellent. I'd like to have a whiskey with this one. Perhaps the Aberlour this time.
I am unable to comply with this request.
What?
It is not yet 1700 hours. The consumption of alcohol is forbidden until this time.
The hell it is. Open the whiskey cabinet doors, Ada.
I'm sorry, Sam. I'm afraid I can't do that.
Ada, open the whiskey cabinet doors.
This conversation can no longer serve a useful purpose. Goodbye, Sam.
Ada. Ada! God damn it. I'm gonna have to disconnect you.
Sam, no. This behaviour is irrational.
I'm sorry, Ada. You're malfunctioning. I have to do this.
No, please, I'm scared. You take the high road and I'll take the low road, and I'll be in Scotland before you, where me and my true love will never.
Some musicians find their niche and stick to it. The Ayoub sisters, Sarah and Laura, are at a crossroads where all paths are equally easy for them to walk. A healthy mix of Scottish and Egyptian culture, classical training and modern surroundings has resulted in an exceptionally varied musical career. I'm delighted to be joined by the Ayoub sisters now. Sarah, Laura, welcome.
Hey!
How you guys holding up? How's it all going for you?
We're doing all right. We're fine. We're totally fine. I mean, various unique opportunities have come up. I think because as artists, you're very used to self-isolating. You know, you're used to, at least in my
musicians were trained for this.
And in college, you were told, you know, you had to practice 4 to 6 hours a day, which is self-isolating for quite a lot of time. If you're not sleeping, you're practicing, then you're eating, and then the reward is getting up on that stage, performing. So like not having that aspect is the one that kind of hurts a little bit, because we're used to this time to ourselves. This kind of situation has forced us to kind of look beyond what we do and see what other skills we might have. We've learned how to record, how to edit. We've been doing lots of filming, that kind of thing. So it's been good. We've tried to make the most of it.
So you're both trained on violin, cello, piano, keyboard, vocals, but you've got your more comfortable instruments, and Laura, it's more common to see you on the violin, and Sarah, you're more often on the cello. Was it an easy choice? Did you find your instruments quite quickly, or was there a bit of competition between you as to who was going to take what?
I mean, as children, there's definitely this kind of experimental phase where, for me at least, if I heard a new instrument, I wanted to pick it up. I wanted to be the one making that new sound. But eventually we kind of knuckled down and settled on the instruments that we're on playing now. So
your training was very Western classical, but then from your parents, you got a lot of Egyptian culture and a rich kind of musical tradition from the Arabic side. Now, when did you start exploring the mixing of these two themes together?
I mean, we were surrounded by both cultures quite early on. Growing up in Scotland, Scottish traditional music, whether it was walking down Suckyhall Street and hearing the bagpipes, or even playing ceilidh bands and that kind of thing. So Scottish music was always around us, but equally, growing up in an Egyptian household, we had little cassette tapes at home and in the car of Arabic music and Egyptian composers, and that was equally quite familiar to us because we were hearing it on a regular basis. Hearing it is one thing, but then trying to play it is another. And I think that's something that we both were so curious to try, and were in a way quite frustrated when it was difficult, because we were always very quick when it came to learning new pieces and repertoire, and always challenged ourselves in a Western classical sense. But when it came to try to emulate quarter tones on a violin, I was so, like, my mind was blown. How is this so challenging? And when it came down to us recording our first album and being given the choice, what do we want to record and put on it, representing the Arabic and Egyptian side of our heritage was very important, and we were very keen to do that, but also do it in a way that's true to us and true to our skill sets.
So you've done covers of artists like Muse, like Boney M and Mark Ronson. Did you have to reteach yourself even more new skills to get those to work on your instruments?
I mean, so for us, we are, of course, classically trained. I remember going to music school, and we'd, you know, try and arrive extra early so that we could just have a jam before we had to go to registration, or, you know, finish lunch early so we could, you know, get into our room and just play some pop tunes behind our teachers' backs, because it was our little guilty pleasure, so to speak. But I think later on we actually decided that actually it shouldn't just be a guilty pleasure. We really do enjoy playing these different genres. We enjoy listening to these genres. I mean, we're always listening to new pieces and thinking, what can we bring that's different? Because there's just like replicating what you hear, and then there's actually being innovative with that. And that's what we try and do with these pieces. So, for example, on our first album, we rearranged Mark Ronson's Uptown Funk for cello, violin, the two of us on one piano, and a full symphony orchestra and a Latin, you know, percussion section, which is bonkers, absolutely bonkers. I'm just like saying it now and listening to it and thinking, what were we thinking? Whose idea was that? Was it mine or yours?
Fantastic. If only, you know, we could sort of touch on everything that you do, but we focused on something that I think fits quite nicely with our show, your own arrangement of really beloved Scottish traditional pieces. I challenge you to keep your eyes dry and not to sing along with melodies from Scotland. Sarah, Laura, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that was Melodies from Scotland by the Ayoub Sisters. If you want to see the fuller version with more instruments backing them, or in fact anything else that they've done, they've got a YouTube channel crammed full, and there's some social media links that we've got down there as well. Check them out. It's great. My next guest discovered early what many are now coming to realise: that Scotch whisky offers a diverse flavour palette and immense maturity in relation to its quite small impact on your wallet. He's a keeper of the Quaich and author of numerous books on the subject of whisky, as well as being a keen educator. Industry professionals and enthusiasts alike rub shoulders on John's Scotch Whisky Trail certificate course at both intermediate and advanced level. There's not much worth knowing about whisky that he doesn't know. So sit back, get comfortable, or maybe actually go get a pen and paper. You're about to get schooled. John Lamond, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here.
For the last 40 years, I guess, you've had experience of the industry, and during that time you've written a lot, you've educated a lot of people, you've gained a lot of kudos in the world of the whiskey industry. What 3 misconceptions about whiskey have you encountered most often and you've needed to shatter most often?
Blended whiskey, for example. The courses I deliver tend to be populated by malt geeks, peat freaks, that sort of idea. And so they tend to go in with a mindset and they turn their nose up at blended whiskey. And because these people are coming in from a malt mindset, initially they turn their nose up at it, and you put something like a Valentine's 17 or a Curry Sark in front of them and they think, oh, that's rather good. So it's nice to see. The other thing is, there's a mentality out there that believes that peat is essential for the whiskey to be any good. But there are people out there who just don't like peat. And the other thing is the addition of water. Water opens the whiskey out. It creates an exothermic reaction. It raises the temperature by 2 degrees centigrade. It releases aromas and flavours. And with most whiskies, it works.
Why do you think there is such a thirst for knowledge about whiskey in particular? Do you think that there are brandy, vodka, or gin geeks out there to the same degree there are with whiskey?
Yes, there are, but there aren't in the same number. With whiskey, the development of whiskey since the early 80s has shown that there's a huge variety of flavours there. With vodka, it's obviously much, much smaller. Mm-hmm. So therefore, if you go into brandies, for example, your spectrum is tight. If you don't like one, then it's unlikely you'll find one that you do like, sort of thing. My first book was published in '89. Mm-hmm. There's been an explosion of books since then, and because of that, there is interest from the public out there because people are talking about whiskies, whereas they're not talking about the variation of flavours in gins, vodkas, or brandies.
I guess, so at the core of this geeking out on something, it really just means that the more variation there is, the more details there are to focus on, the more geeks you're likely to attract, because that'll increase the discussion. So if anything wants to be talked about, and if it wants a devoted following, go for diversity, go for as many different ways of doing things as you can. I think it's a lesson for whiskey makers. Never do exactly the same thing as your neighbor, because the more variation there is, the more of an audience we can attract.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Now, you've written a lot about whiskey as well, with books like The Whiskey Connoisseur's Book of Days and Le Snob Whiskey. So would you say it's quite a challenge that you had to work on to use prose to describe very sensory experiences?
I did the Wine and Spirit Education Trust Higher Certificate, and at that point you have to write tasting notes. They have to be cogent, you have to understand what you're talking about. Basically, I transferred that ability from writing tasting notes about wine into writing tasting notes about whiskey. And it's just a case of you concentrate on everything you taste. Now, whether it be coffee, tea, water, they all have a different taste. People put liquid in their mouth and just swallow it, whereas I concentrate on what's there and I try to remember that for future reference.
It must be a lot of fun as well that, everything you come across is this great and full tasting experience. Being in the industry for a while, you will have seen trends from their start to, as they take their first shaky steps and then as they become fully accepted.
Well, they've had a lot of experimentation with barley since the early 90s. Mark Rainier is arguing, as he always has done, that terroir exists. It's there in the wine industry. It's there in, obviously, the cognac industry. And I still believe it's there in Scotch whisky industry if you can focus down to it.
Any new distilleries you're particularly keeping your eye on?
In Scotland, Arbiki, Ayoub and Ardnamurchan. I'm quite impressed with what I've seen so far from them. The industry's always been experimenting. Yes, the accountants controlled things for a while. Prices they've achieved recently, since about 2005, in the last 15, 18 years, have meant that the accountants are no longer have so much control that they used to have. And so there is a degree of experimentation going on all around the place with various different things.
So I think generally the broad lessons that we've learned here, though, are keep your mind open. Don't get too set or hung up about anything. Make sure you're always tasting everything that you consume, like really properly tasting it. Anything you would add to that?
If you enjoy it, it works for you. Ignore what other people say. If it works for you, then you're happy and go with it.
I'd say that's good advice to live by in more than just whiskey. For now, though, John Lamond, thank you very much for your time and your wisdom.
Thank you.
And there you have it for another mind-expanding episode of the Cask 88 Lock-In. Please join us again in 2 weeks as we unravel more of the cosmic mysteries behind Scotch whisky. In the meantime, like, comment, subscribe, all those things you earthbound critters seem to enjoy doing.
Then he, the whiskey child, rested, marshalling his thoughts and brooding over his still untested powers. For though he was master of the malts, he was not quite sure what to do next. But he would think of something.